That night felt like any other. Cool air brushed against my skin as I hurried down the empty street, trying to make it home. I had just left my boyfriend's house after an argument that left me more restless than usual. It was well past midnight, and the roads were deserted, except for the occasional distant sound of a barking dog. As I turned the corner, I spotted her, sitting alone by the roadside, clutching her stomach. She looked like she was in pain, and something about her eyes, wide and filled with terror, made me stop. I should have kept walking, but I didn't. "Hey," I called out, approaching slowly. "Are you okay? It's really late. Where's your family?" She looked up, her face pale and drawn, tears streaming down her cheeks. I have no one," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My father disowned me. And my mother. She died when I was born. I'm alone." I froze. What was I supposed to do? Leave her there. The guilt twisted in my gut. But what could I do for a stranger, especially one who was pregnant? I wasn't ready for what came next. I glanced at my phone. No signal. Of course. My place was too far, and the buses had long stopped running. My boyfriend's house was closer, and even though we'd just fought, maybe he'd understand. "Look," I said, kneeling beside her. "You can't stay out here. I'll take you somewhere safe." She nodded weakly, still clutching her belly. It looked like she was about to go into labor any moment, and that made my heart race even faster. I helped her stand, and we slowly made our way to Ugo's place. The whole time, I could feel her grip tighten with each step, her breathing shallow and uneven. She was in serious pain. When we reached his house, I knocked on the door, hoping he was still awake. The door creaked open, and Ugo's eyes went wide when he saw us. "Who is this?" he asked, clearly shocked. "Why are you bringing her here at this hour?" I quickly explained the situation, how I had found her alone and how she had no one. He looked skeptical, even annoyed, but as I pleaded, I could see the conflict in his eyes. He finally stepped aside to let us in. That's when things got worse. She collapsed onto the couch, moaning in pain. I rushed to her side and realized what was happening. Her water had broken. Panic surged through me. I had learned the basics in medical school, but this was beyond anything I'd ever expected to deal with. My mind raced as I knelt beside her, trying to recall everything I'd been taught. "Ugo, I need towels, anything clean, and hot water," I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. He stood there, frozen for a moment, staring at the scene unfolding before him. "Why didn't you take her to the hospital?" he snapped, but there was no time for arguing. The look on my face must have made him realize that. She gripped my hand, her face contorted in pain. I can't do this," she gasped, her voice weak. "You can," I said firmly. "You have to. It's the only way. You need to push, or both you and your baby. You won't make it." Her eyes, filled with fear and exhaustion, met mine, and in that moment, something passed between us, a silent understanding. She nodded, though barely, and tried to muster the strength to push. "Come on, you can do this," I urged, keeping my tone as steady as possible, though inside I was panicking. My heart was racing as I guided her through the contractions. After what felt like an eternity, she let out a final agonizing scream, and then I heard it, the sharp, unmistakable cry of a newborn. Relief flooded through me. I had done it. I cleaned the baby up and cut the umbilical cord as carefully as I could, feeling a strange mix of pride and disbelief at what had just happened. When I looked at the mother, I smiled for the first time that night. "It's a girl," I whispered, handing the newborn to her. But she didn't respond. Confused, I looked closer. Her chest wasn't moving. Her eyes were closed, and her face, once so full of pain, was now eerily calm. "No," I murmured, placing my ear against her chest. Nothing. No heartbeat. Panic surged through me. I checked again, but it was too late. She was gone, just like that. I stood there, frozen in shock, my mind reeling. How could she have survived labor only to die moments after? The baby wailed in my arms, but I could barely hear it over the deafening roar of my thoughts. "Ugo!" I screamed, running into the living room where he had been pacing. "She's dead! The mother is dead!" He turned to face me, his expression shifting from concern to something darker. What do we do?" I stammered. His face hardened. We can't let anyone know. Not now. We'll be blamed. What are you talking about? I whispered, horrified. We need to call the police or an ambulance. Something. No, he said, his voice low and firm. They'll think we're responsible. You brought her here and she died in my house. Think about it, Kichi. We can't get involved. I felt my stomach drop. He was right. It didn't matter what the truth was. No one would believe us. But the alternative? What he was suggesting? We have to get rid of the body, he continued, his tone colder than I'd ever heard before. Dump it somewhere. No one will ever know. I shook my head, backing away from him. You can't be serious. We can't just dump her body like that. He stepped closer, grabbing my arms. Do you want to go to jail? Do you want to lose everything? Because that's what will happen if anyone finds out she died here. You'll lose your future, your career, everything you've worked for. His words struck me like a physical blow. He was playing on my worst fears, and I hated that a part of me believed him. My eyes darted to the baby, still crying softly in the background. What about the baby? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We'll keep her, he said too quickly. No one has to know. We'll say she's ours. I felt sick. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. I had only wanted to help, and now I was standing in the middle of a nightmare. That night, I watched as Ugo wrapped the woman's body in a white sheet and carried her out to his car. He didn't say anything to me as he left, but something in his eyes terrified me. He was hiding something far worse than what he had already told me. Hours passed and I sat there, alone with the baby, my thoughts spiraling out of control. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. I should have gone to the police. I should have done something, anything, other than this. When Ugo finally returned, his face was pale, and he was trembling. It's done, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I took care of it. Over the next few days, I tried to put it behind me. I tried to care for the baby as best I could, convincing myself that we had done the right thing, or at least the only thing we could have done. But then I started noticing things. Strange things. The nightmares were the worst. Every night, I dreamt of the woman. Her pale, lifeless face staring back at me, her lips moving soundlessly as if trying to speak. In the dreams, she would reach out to me, her eyes full of accusation. Give me back my baby. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, but the terror didn't stop when I opened my eyes. I began hearing whispers in the middle of the night, soft, faint, but unmistakable. They always seemed to be coming from the baby's room. And the baby? She barely cried. It was strange, unsettling. She would just stare at me, her eyes wide, as if she knew something I didn't. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but it only got worse. One night, I woke up to find the baby's crib empty. Panicking, I rushed into the living room, only to find her lying on the floor next to the front door, perfectly still, her eyes wide open. The next morning, I confronted Ugo. There's something wrong, I said, my voice shaking. I keep having these nightmares. I'm hearing things. The baby, she's not normal, Ugo. I think we did something wrong. He stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he said quietly, It's just your guilt talking. You're overthinking it. But deep down, I knew he was lying. He knew more than he was letting on. And I was about to find out just how far he was willing to go. One evening, as Ugo stepped out to handle business, I overheard him on the phone. The conversation chilled me to my core. It's done, he whispered. I have the body and the placenta. I'll be at the shrine in an hour. My heart raced. What shrine? What was he talking about? And why the placenta? I had to know the truth. I followed him that night, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. He drove out of the city and into the countryside, finally stopping at a small, decrepit-looking hut. The moonlight barely illuminated the scene, but I could see him hand something to an old man standing at the door. I watched as they disappeared inside. And then I heard chanting. When Ugo returned home, I confronted him. I couldn't take it anymore. "What have you done?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "What have you gotten us into?" He stared at me, his eyes dark and empty. "It's too late, Kichi. You need to let this go. We're both in too deep now." From that night onward, things spiraled out of control. The whispers grew louder, the baby's presence more unnerving. And Ugo, he was changing. His greed had consumed him, turning him into someone I barely recognized. I should have run when I had the chance. But I didn't. And now, I'm not sure if I'll ever... That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house made me jump, and every shadow seemed to shift in the dark corners of the room. My mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept seeing her face, the woman's pale, lifeless face, and those haunting eyes of the baby, staring at me like she knew something terrible was about to happen. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Ugo pacing back and forth in the kitchen. He looked more agitated than usual. His eyes were bloodshot and his hair was disheveled. It was as if he hadn't slept either. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. I nodded, feeling my stomach churn. "What is it?" He sat down at the table, his hands trembling slightly. "I've made some decisions about the baby and about us." I braced myself for what was coming next. "We can't keep the baby, Kichi," he said bluntly. "It's too dangerous. People will start asking questions, and we can't afford that." "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We can't just abandon her. She's innocent." "Innocent?" Ugo scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "You've seen the way she looks at us. There's something unnatural about her. You've felt it, haven't you?" I wanted to argue, to tell him he was being paranoid, but deep down I knew he wasn't entirely wrong. There was something unsettling about the baby, something I couldn't quite explain. But abandoning her? That was too much. "We'll take her to an orphanage," Ugo continued. "Somewhere far away, where no one knows who she is. We'll leave her there, and we'll never speak of this again." I stared at him, horrified by his callousness. How could he talk about abandoning a child like she was nothing? But then again, this was the same man who had helped dispose of a dead body without a second thought. "No," I said firmly. "I won't do that. We can't just throw her away like she doesn't matter." Ugo's expression darkened. "You don't have a choice, Kichi. If you don't do this, I will. And if you try to stop me, I'll make sure you regret it." His words sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't the man I had fallen in love with. This was someone else. Someone dangerous. I had to get out of there. That night, while Ugo was out, I packed a small bag with essentials for the baby and myself. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The whispers had grown louder, and the nightmares were becoming unbearable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was closing in on us. I waited until the house was silent, and then I slipped out the back door, carrying the baby in my arms. The cool night air felt refreshing against my skin, but it did little to calm the fear bubbling up inside me. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to get as far away from Ugo as possible. I walked for what felt like hours, the streets eerily quiet under the pale moonlight. Every shadow seemed to move, and every gust of wind sounded like a whisper in my ear. "Give me back my baby." I shuddered, clutching the child tighter to my chest. Was it my imagination? Or had I really heard that voice? The baby stirred in my arms, her tiny fingers gripping my shirt. I looked down at her, her innocent face peaceful for once, and I felt a pang of guilt. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe everything that had happened was all in my head. But there was no going back now. I had made my choice. Eventually, I reached the outskirts of town. There, nestled between two crumbling buildings, was a small, run-down church. Its doors were open, and a soft light flickered from inside. It felt like a sign. I stepped inside, the old wooden floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The church was empty, save for a lone priest standing at the altar, his head bowed in prayer. He looked up as I approached, his expression kind and gentle. "Can I help you, my child?" he asked softly. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. Then the words came tumbling out. I need help. My baby. She's not mine, and there's something wrong." The priest listened patiently as I told him everything. How I had found the woman, how she had died in my arms, and how Ugo had forced me to cover it up. I told him about the whispers, the nightmares, and the baby's eerie silence. When I finished, the priest remained quiet for a long time, his eyes filled with sympathy. "You've been through a great deal, my child," he said finally. "But this burden you carry, it is not yours alone. There are forces at work here that you cannot understand." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" The priest sighed, stepping closer to the baby in my arms. "This child, she is tied to something much darker than you realize. The mother's spirit is restless. It seeks justice for the wrongs done to her." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. "What can I do?" The priest looked at me, his expression grave. "You must return the child to her rightful family. Only then will the mother's spirit find peace." "But I don't know who her family is," I stammered. "I don't even know her name." "You know more than you think," the priest said cryptically. "The answers are already within you. You just need to listen." I left the church that night, my mind racing with questions. Who was this woman? And how could I possibly find her family? But as I walked through the empty streets, a name suddenly came to me. Mrs. Nam. I had heard it on the news the day I found the woman. She was the mother of a missing pregnant girl, and the description matched the woman I had helped. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I contacted Mrs. Nam, using the number I had seen on the news. She was hesitant at first, but when I mentioned the baby, her voice changed. She was desperate to find her grandchild, and I knew I had no choice but to meet with her. We arranged to meet at a small cafe in the city. As I sat at the table, waiting for her to arrive, my heart pounded in my chest. Would she believe me? And what would happen if Ugo found out? When Mrs. Nam finally arrived, her eyes immediately locked onto the baby in my arms. Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached for the child, her hands trembling. "My daughter," she whispered, cradling the baby. Thank you for bringing her back to me." As Mrs. Nam held the baby, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. I had done the right thing, but it wasn't over yet. That night, I returned to the house, hoping to pack the rest of my things and leave for good. But when I walked through the door, I was met with a sight that chilled me to the bone. Ugo was standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by stacks of cash. His eyes were wild, and he was muttering to himself, his hands shaking as he counted the money over and over again. "I did it," he whispered, barely acknowledging my presence. "I finally did it." What are you talking about?" I asked, taking a step back. He looked up at me, a crazed smile spreading across his face. "The witch doctor. He promised me wealth beyond my wildest dreams, and now I have it." My blood ran cold. "Ugo, what did you do?" He laughed, a manic, hollow sound that echoed through the empty house. "I did what I had to do. I sacrificed her, the woman, and now I have everything." I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there. I had to run before it was too late. But before I could reach the door, Ugo lunged at me, his hands gripping my shoulders. "You can't leave me, Kichi," he snarled. "We're in this together. You helped me cover it up. You're just as guilty as I am." Terror surged through me, and I pushed him away, scrambling for the door. "I'm done, Ugo," I shouted. "I'm not staying here, not after what you've done." He let out a furious roar and reached for something on the table, a knife. In that moment, I knew I was fighting for my life. I bolted for the door, but Ugo was faster. He grabbed me by the arm, pulling me back with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. The knife gleamed in his hand, and for a split second, I thought this was the end. But then, something strange happened. The air in the room grew cold, unnaturally cold, and a low, mournful wail filled the house. Ugo froze, his eyes wide with fear, as the ghostly figure of the woman appeared before us, her pale, lifeless eyes fixed on him. "Give me back my baby." Ugo dropped the knife, his hands trembling. "No, no, this can't be happening." The woman stepped closer, her form flickering like a shadow in the moonlight. Her voice was cold and hollow, filled with an anger that sent shivers down my spine. "You took my life. You took my child. Now you will pay." With a final, blood-curdling scream, the woman lunged at Ugo, her ghostly hands wrapping around his throat. He let out a strangled cry, his eyes bulging in terror as he collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. And just like that, it was over. I stood there, frozen in shock, as the woman's figure slowly faded into the shadows. Ugo lay motionless on the floor, his body limp and lifeless. The house was silent, save for the faint sound of the wind howling outside. It was finally over. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at Ugo's lifeless body. Time seemed to blur, and I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching everything from a distance. Eventually, I turned and walked out the door, leaving the house and the horrors inside behind me. As I stepped into the cool night air, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had happened slowly lift from my shoulders. I had survived, but I would never be the same.